This is a series of lectures for Political Science 101, Principles of Political Science. Today we'll be talking about reform, Huntington's Chapter 6, and Huntington Chapter 7, which is horizontal integration and the like. All right, so why is reform so hard? We talked about revolution in the last lecture. We talked about wars of independence. Why is it so hard to reform? You see there's a problem on the horizon, and why wouldn't you just adjust? This is true of a democracy as well as a dictatorship. You would think people would want to hold on to power, and consequently, they would make the necessary changes. Well, it's so hard because there's a fight. It's a two-front war between the conservatives and the revolutionaries. Now, you'll notice I haven't said liberals. Conservatives are those that want to keep the system basically as it is, typically benefiting those in the elite class. Revolutionaries want to change that and tear it down. So there's a fight between those two. Liberal ideologies are sort of a middle ground, and in our structure become neither fish nor fowl. In other words, they're going to play a much smaller and insignificant part. Plus, liberal ideologies don't really come into play here. We're talking about the extremes, those that want to keep it the way it is and those that want it to change. So, how do you reform? Well, oddly enough, in order to be a reformer, you basically need political skills, right? A reformer needs political skills. A revolutionary does not. The choices are many, obviously, and varied, but priorities and choices have to be set in place, and a balanced structure between the changes in the socioeconomic structure has to be compared to and leveled against changes in political institutions. Now, I've used the term socioeconomic several times. What we're talking about here is it's not just the social organization of the society, it's the economic well-being of those in the structure. So those things have to be really considered. And who do they have to be considered by? The political institutions. It's their job, political institutions, to understand, engage the social forces, and make adjustments in policies that are good for the nation as a whole, not just one group. Okay? So what are the strategies that are available to the reformer? Well, you can make known all goals at an early stage and then press for as many as possible. Right? We need to change this, this, and this. And then take sort of a blitzkrieg approach, go after it all. That's one approach. The other approach we call the foot in the door approach. Concealing what your aims really are, pressing for one change at a time. It's an incremental or a Fabian approach, right? You're branching it off. So those are the two approaches for the reformer, okay? So for modernization, what seems to work best is this Fabian strategy with a blitzkrieg tactic. So let me explain this. By stepping back and talking about a blitzkrieg strategy. A blitzkrieg strategy doesn't work because it alerts and activates potential opposition. Here we come. The music is playing in the field as we march. Everyone knows we're on our way. So basically, people that are fighting that position are forewarned, which means they can put in motion structures, mechanisms, whatever, to deal with that. So this is why comprehensive reform doesn't work, right, if you take this blitzkrieg strategy. It mobilizes into politics the wrong groups at the wrong time, on the wrong issues. In other words, you can't be too upfront or out front on what your intentions are, because it warns those that would not agree to establish a way of dealing with what you want changed. Whereas a Fabian strategy of isolating one set of issues from another tends to minimize the opposition. And so the reformer confronts less. In other words, if you make incremental moves, they're less likely to set off bells and whistles and warn anyone. So for the same reason, we want blitzkrieg tactics used. All right, so we want a Fabian strategy with these blitzkrieg tactics. In other words, focus on a particular, but then throw everything you've got at that particular. Because what that does is it creates opposition only on that issue, and that's much more manageable than opposition on a host of issues. So let's give an example here. Racial desegregation in the United States. Those in power, right, introduced abrupt, firm, and irreversible policies that sort of change behavior, but not attitudes and values. We don't want people being discriminated against, but we didn't spend the time to really change the values and the attitudes that were necessary to give people a rationale for dealing with that. Okay? So the opportunity and the time for preparation of those that were against this, the public for change is not necessarily related here to effectiveness and the smoothness of the change, but by giving people the opportunity and time for preparation, this means you can have greater resistance, right? All right. So the key question for the reformer concerns the rate and the sequence of mobilization of new groups into politics. And you have to balance support of that against opponents on each new issue. In other words, if we're going to take on desegregation, we have to limit it to desegregation. We don't want to go much further than that, because then it's a much more difficult front to fight on. You become more vulnerable. So violence as a tool of reform, for example, works only for so long. It's a novel technique, riots, that sort of thing. If you think about Martin Luther King, it was a steady, peaceful movement forward. If you think about the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, what you see is a Thurgood Marshall heading that and taking the approach that, well, we're not going to win the court of public opinion. It's too costly. Trying to influence Congress people that they should be sensitive to these issues and do something about it, well, that's going to take a very, very long time. And it's going to have lots of opposition because they're going to be aware of it. But his strategy was, if we go to the courts and we file suit, we only have to deal with the court. And once the court makes a decision, that becomes the law of the land. But Thurgood Marshall understood that if the issue were too big that they came before the Supreme Court might have a difficult time with it. And also, the court is going to be somewhat reactive. So what he did was he threw up a few cases at the Supreme Court that he was prepared to have the court reject. And then he brought forward, in Brown versus the Board of Education, a case that he really pushed to get over the top. Throw them a few bones, let them beat up these few cases, and then, get them acclimated to dealing with them, and then come at them with the big guns. So there you have a Fabian approach, with a blitzkrieg sort of tactic in terms of just dealing with that one issue. So again, you want to keep in check those that might resist you. And honestly, reform can lead to revolution. It can catalyze that rather than a substitute for it. So you have to be careful here. You may think that your reforms are in place or moving, and that's fine, but it could also be a catalyst for revolution because fundamentally you're raising expectations, right? And also the very fact that the regime in power is basically making concessions encourages what? Further demands. And eventually, at some point, those institutions cannot meet those demands. The gap increases between expectations and the ability to deliver, and what you have is a road to revolution. So if you look at the American approach, concessions produce stability, right? In the face of domestic sort of unrest, you get demands, but you don't get disabling, results in the face of, these demands. Why? Because there's a diversification of institutions and a dispersion of power that helps meet those demands. You can take a demand and you can place it in a part of the bureaucracy that deals with it, and then there's always an appeal out of that part of the bureaucracy. So reform and revolution are really dependent upon the centralization of power, right? The nature of the reforms, the composition of the revolutionaries, what groups, and the timing of the reforms, right? All of these affect, right, the probability of revolution. The nature of it, the composition of the revolutionaries, and the timing of the reforms. Let's just explore these a little bit. The nature of the reforms really comes down to how far-reaching they are and the political institutions' ability to meet those demands. The composition of the revolutionaries is basically, are we talking about those that hold the pitchforks, or are we talking about just the middle-class intelligentsia? What are we talking about here? I'm not bringing in, obviously, the elite class because they want things to remain the same. The middle-class intelligentsia in the city is not enough. So the composition has to have a proper mix of middle-class intelligentsia from the city and, those in the lower class of poor folks that live outside the city. And the other is the timing of the reforms. Are these reforms based upon a need in the moment, or are these far-reaching, ongoing problems? Exactly when can these demands be met? How they're being met? All of this comes down to those three elements. If we're talking about reform moving towards revolution, the nature of the reforms, the composition of the revolutionaries, and the timing of those reforms. So let me give you an example. Let's talk about policy reforms. Policy reforms can make revolution more likely because they raise those expectations of further gains, right? And they have to, therefore, as they make that effort, imply that there are weaknesses that exist in the current existing regime. If we're going to change the policy, it raises expectations that things will get better. But in saying there's a need to change the policy, it means that policy that was put in place was not really to serve the people. And so that actually, by making policy reforms when things get bad, can be problematic and actually lead to revolution. What about, as an example, leadership reforms? Well, leadership reforms actually can drain away the dynamic elements in the revolutionary movement because you've changed leadership, and we know that leadership takes some time to begin to make those changes. And basically, when you have, a movement, elements in a revolutionary movement, and join them into the establishment, you make the revolution less likely. In other words, if you take those that are complaining or rising up against the present leadership and you bring them into leadership roles, you can, and I'm going a little further than maybe Huntington would go, you can corrupt them. So those that want to reform become part of that class of people that are, I wouldn't say oppressing in a democracy, but certainly keeping down. If you're familiar with the book Animal Farm, which I think is probably the best book on human beings and political relationships, it's only 98 pages. In that book, there's a revolution against the farmer who's oppressing the different classes, and different animals represent different classes. The horse is, sort of the working poor. And then you get to the pigs who are smart, and they're really leading the revolution. And what happens is they run off the farmer, and they have all the rules for the society, constitution, if you will, on the side of a barn. All things that walk on four legs, good, all those on two is bad. And as things progress, more and more of those particular rules begin to disappear. The side of the barn, they just takes them off. The pigs do. And eventually, towards the end, you see the pigs sitting with the farmer, cutting deals and manipulating those beneath them again. That's what we're talking about here. Leadership reforms means you're taking out some, but you're bringing them into the process. So that's problematic. What about the timing of reforms? Well, you have to understand that counter-elites are more likely to make demands during periods of minimal and maximal power, right? You get these counter-elites, people that are suffering or have a problem with the society is structured, they're more likely to make those demands during periods where there's minimal and maximum power. We say minimal power, we're talking about here little incentive to accept reforms. Reforms that are too small in relation to the aspirations that exist out there. And so there's frustration. In a maximum situation, you have little incentive to do anything. So they're close to getting total power. So in a situation where the timing of those reforms is maximizing itself, there's probably a pulling back a bit because there is more of a likelihood that those elites are going to grab power. What about the intermediate power relationship? The reformers don't have minimal, they don't have maximal. What about the intermediate power? That's most likely to accept reforms of inclusion. In other words, it's that middle ground that where change can be made in some sort of reasonable way where there's reform. Remember, you've got the reformers and you've got the revolutionaries. So the reformers have many, many possibilities, whereas the revolutionary is looking for opportunities. Possibilities versus opportunities. Possibilities for change give people hope. Revolutionaries need opportunity where the folks have given up and where they can step into that breach. So basically, there are two critical groups here, as I said before, right, in revolution. There's that urban middle-class intelligentsia, and there's the peasantry. Again, that word is more reflective of a certain time in history. We'll just call them the poor. And the reforms are directed at what? One, they could be a catalyst for revolution, or the reforms could be for a substitute for revolution, right? Which would be a means of placating those middle-class intelligentsia and the poor. All right. Reform becomes real only when it becomes organized. You can't have a reform without organization. You put an organization together for many different types of reforms, you weaken your effect of accomplishing that. So the Fabian approach is take a step in. Let's do everything we've got at this one issue, and then the next issue. It limits the likelihood that others will rise up against you and prepare themselves for it. And it makes it more likely that those things will be put in place, and therefore, for the reformers, it could forestall any revolution. Okay, the middle-class intelligentsia sees movement being made, and that's really important. So reform only becomes real when it becomes organized, right? The peasants need organization if they're going to be politically active. And any effective organization for the poor comes with effective political parties. Now, it seems like I just went someplace far afield with political parties. But I want to take you back to that line for modernization moving forward, the four quadrants. Think of political parties and the media, which we'll talk about, as sitting below that line and representing a stabilizing force that if you think of a triangle, almost like a seesaw effect, right? Where you've got the triangle in the middle. And that's political parties and the media. And their job is to do what? Take the demands of the social forces, right? And communicate those to the political institutions. And their other job is to take the perspective, and the challenges facing the political institutions in giving the social forces what they want, and communicating those back to the social forces. When the media and the political parties become fractured, where they don't serve that role anymore, they're become sort of far right, far left, that's problematic in more than one way. But before we get there, I want to talk about what Huntington discusses in Chapter 7 of his book. I want to specifically talk about horizontal integration and vertical assimilation. Again, socioeconomic classes. That's vertical. It's moving up, right, from the poor to the middle class to the elite class. It creates political community, right, a process. So modernizing, right, produces what? A political consciousness. And it'll lead to parties, right, that come together. It's a social force, right? This party stands for what we believe in, so we'll join it. Think about the Republicans, who were initially the anti-slavery party. And for some 60 years after, the Civil War, blacks supported the Republican Party. At that juncture, they realized this party has not done much for us, and they were easily co-opted by the Democratic Party. And that's where most, African Americans and people of color reside to this day. So participation, right, has to be looked at in terms of institutionalization, right, balancing these two. Again, social forces, political institutions, right, participation from social forces, institutionalization is the political institutions. So if the political institutions, right, are greater, right, than the forces, right, what you get is instability, right? In other words, if you have participation, and that participation is in excess of the institutionalization, political institutions, right, are not able to handle the demands made by those participating. Social force participation goes up, political institutionalization remains the same or is lower, and you've got instability. Why? The institutions can't meet the demands of the social forces. So those participating are disappointed by the institutions that they wish to meet their demands. Now, if the participation is less than institutionalization, right, you don't get a lot of social forces making demands, but you've got a lot of political institutions in place, you can have stability. So low levels of participation, if they're about equal to institutionalization, and again, this is not a numeric thing. We can, we're not doing algebra here. We're talking in general terms. So if low levels of participation by those social forces is roughly about equal to the necessary amount of political institutionalization, roughly, you still have instability. Why? You need to have institutions, right, where they're going to meet the social forces' demands, right? So if you have low levels of participation and you have low levels of institutionalization, that creates instability because you're going to move forward. And we don't know if that participation is going to go up and institutionalization will remain the same or go down. But if you have high levels of participation and you have high levels of political institutionalization, you're going to have stability. So what does this lead us to? Future stability, right, is a function of social force participation and political institutionalization, right? If you can organize and institutionalize that participation, you're going to have political parties. And that's, or was, a very important factor in stabilizing the society. Because what do political parties do? They structure, they organize, and they expand participation. At least that's what they should be doing, right? They take the demands of the people, they structure and they organize those, and they expand people being brought into the process so the social frustration remains low. They are an entity against which the people's frustration can be flung. And what you see today is you see a fracturing of that where each party has their own camp, and they have a vested interest in pointing at the other party and how the other party is fighting the needs of those people, whatever group it is, elites or the average folk. And as a consequence, they make the other party the bad guy. And then it allows them to lock down. We're fighting for you. That's why we will not yield. And you get a very stagnating government, and eventually you get no real political reform. You get no new policies that people feel are effective, and it leads to social frustration anyway. That's why public opinion around the Congress is very, very low. I mean, approval of the Congress is very, very, very low. Last time I checked, it was around 10, 12%. Yet people really support their individual politicians. You know, their senators from their state or their representatives. Those folks have a pretty high rating, which of course is nonsensical. In the long run, in the aggregate, when they all get together, things don't work. So does it really matter if you really support your congressperson, you think they're really doing a great job? Well, not in terms of creating policy, no. But in terms of you feeling that someone's in there fighting for you, yes. And that tends to keep people more, if not satisfied, more acquiescent, more willing to let things work out. So political parties and these politicians that are part of those parties have a mechanism that's put in place where the frustrations of people can be mirrored by their politicians. You know, I'm fighting the fight for you. You don't have any idea how frustrating it is. All of them go back home and talk to their constituents about how the other party's blocking this and blocking that, and they're locking down Congress. We're not making any progress. And their constituents believe them because they're unaware of exactly what the processes are that are going on within the Congress or how any of that works. So political parties serve a purpose, right? They should be supplementing the institutional strength of the political institutions, right? And they should be instruments for political participation or social mobilization. Why? They want more people to join their party, right? And therefore, they have to increase the strength of those institutions to manage those people as they come in. So participation without organization, right, just degenerates into a mass movement that doesn't really go anywhere. Think of the Occupy movement that occurred a while back. There was no leadership. They couldn't really articulate what they wanted other than they were upset about the 1% and the 99%. And they believed that they should be a movement without leadership or even direction or specific policy. So there was a case where you didn't even have to worry about mounting, resistance to them. They had no organization. They were going to go nowhere at all. And there, of course, if you look back at, people that have analyzed and looked at that movement, what you find is that those that believe in chaos, that the only way to keep others at bay and keep your freedom is to create chaos. They were behind, or certainly, were a force in that movement. But chaos is counter to the idea of forming nations. Now, while it may feel good, and certainly if you have nothing but a chaotic situation, you minimize the likelihood of the political class and the institutions from doing things that hurt you, but they also aren't strong enough to protect you. Remember in the very beginning we talked about why we form nations. So we could be better off, right? Where there could be more liberty, right? Where our lives have more meaning and are less threatened, and where we have a right to acquire things. So chaos really counters all of that. And without going into chaos, the idea of chaos, much further, just as a tangential sort of nod, that's what we're looking at. So, and if you have organization without participation, then what you have is you have these personality cliques. Here, think of Ralph Nader. Typically runs for president, doesn't get many votes. Never his political influence doesn't really go anywhere. But people believe in him, right? So he has an organization. He has a very good organization. But there's no real widespread participation in it. So really what we have is we have a political party, the Green Party, that's a Ralph Nader organization. So, and there are many, many political parties in the United States. We don't hear about them, in some measure because